Hello everyone, hi, good to see you all. So today we are going to be talking about unlocking potential and empowering our children through communication. Just want to start off a little bit about myself. So my name is Caroline Vincent, but people call me Carrie, I do prefer that. I'm a speech and language therapist. I've been working across lots of different avenues. I've worked in early years, I've worked all the way up into school age and college, and I've worked in SEN schools and mainstream schools and special resource provisions and all manner of things. My loves are music, nature and my family. And as it's Neurodiversity Week, I felt it was a safe space to share with you all today. I am on a journey towards understanding my own neurodiversity. I was diagnosed with a specific language difficulty, and I am dyspraxic as well. And I'm currently under assessment for ADHD. So like a lot of women in my age, I think, and a lot of men as well, we are finding out these things a little bit later in life. So it's a bit exciting for me as well. So today we'll be exploring speech, language and communication and navigating the social world. And also I'm going to give a very brief overview of neurodiversity and the double empathy problem, just to give us a background for really what I hope will be the take-home message for you today. And that's all about creating an inclusive environment for everyone and really thinking about the intention behind any of the interventions, behind any of the support that we're giving to our young people. So to start off then, I want to talk a little bit about speech, language and social experience and what that all means. So essentially, speech is the building block of our words. It's our speech sounds. It's those little things that make up the words that we use. In a nutshell, there's a bit more to it than that, but for the purposes of this presentation, in a nutshell, this is speech. And we can think about language as being the words that we use. So we're putting together all of these words. We have an understanding of the word itself, and then we're putting them together in sentences so that they're bits that we can put together to convey or understand meaning. And we also then have what I like to call social experience. So this is a term that's it's not necessarily one that's out there. This is a term that I find from my clinical experience works well for me. I hope you'll find by the end of this presentation why I might want to be changing up the language a little bit. So we might have called this social skills in the past. Yeah, we might have called this social skills in the past. I'm so sorry, my presentation's gone a little bit funny. There we go. We might have called this social skills in the past, but now we have an understanding that that might not necessarily be the best way forward, just because of what those things have been associated with in the past. So what I like to do is call it social experience. What I mean by that is it's the expectations that we bring to our social world and the understanding that we've gained from it. It's the expectations of what I want to get out of my social world, what I want to get out of my communication and my interaction with other people. So we bring what we know from our speech skills, our language skills, and our social experience, the things that we understand about our social world and the things that we feel our social world understands about us and the skills that we have in our communication, and we bring that into our social world. And in our social world, we might be understanding something about ourselves. People in our social world will be looking at us and seeing what we're presenting about ourselves. We're taking all of these things, all of our skills, and we're communicating something about ourselves, and we're receiving other people's communication about themselves. And I'd like you to hold that thought while we just take a brief detour to talk about neurodiversity and the double empathy theory. So hold that in your mind. So essentially, neurodiversity, it's a pretty big word, it's a long word, but it can be split up into two. It's a portmanteau, so we can unpack that together. So neurodiversity is split up into neurological and diversity. Neurological essentially meaning how people's brains work. So it's the idea that it's just how people's brains work. There, I'll stop there. I'm going to get onto that a little bit later. So how people's brains work, and diversity means essentially just lots of different ways of thinking. Sorry, there are lots of different ways to do something. So lots of ways of thinking. And what this can do, if we think about neurodiversity, we can essentially start feeling that there might be different ways of thinking about it, different ways about thinking about neurodiversity, about different ways of people thinking. We can feel that maybe it's ultimately beneficial to have so many different ways of thinking in our societies. And in the past, maybe we've thought about different neurological profiles as being that there are some that are not good and some that are good, and there's this sort of what's called the neurotypical way of thinking. And actually, in more recent times, we've really been challenging that. There's been a movement, there have been thoughts around that where people have been actually saying, well, maybe what this is that there are just lots of different ways of thinking. And that's a biological fact. We know that neurodiversity exists. There are people with ADHD, there are autistic people, there are dyspraxic people, people with dyslexia, all of the above. All of these things absolutely exist. We know that for a fact. And what neurodiversity affirming movements are presenting, are communicating, is that maybe we can think about it a little bit differently. Maybe instead of thinking these things are a problem that need to be fixed, we can embrace that these are just different ways of thinking, and maybe we can all work together through that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So if we're thinking about neurodiversity and as being that embracing everybody's different ways of thinking, it does challenge that medical model. So it challenges that idea that this is something that needs to be changed. And because it challenges that kind of medical model of thinking, it might also challenge the language that we use as well. So here are just a few bits and pieces here, a few pictures for you to have a look at. So up here we have some of the terminology that's been used to describe people who are autistic people in the past. So we might have heard people say in the past that this person suffers from autism. And if you think about how that colours the identity for that person, we're saying that autism is a bad thing and they're really suffering from it. And actually, when we listen to autistic voices, we can get to a point where it's actually just who they are. It's not necessarily something that they're suffering from. There might be parts of it that are very difficult for them, but they're not necessarily suffering from it in and of itself. So we've got that little scalpel up there just to represent that in this way of thinking, if we're using this kind of language and this kind of terminology, we're thinking it needs some kind of medical intervention just for the fact that it is autism. And then we might have used language in the past, something like on the spectrum, and I know for some people that is still a very affirming thing to use. But where some autistic voices have said it's problematic is when we're thinking about being on the spectrum as being more of a linear thing, as opposed to being more of what we might think of it as a spectrum, so more like the thing, the picture underneath this one, lots of different interwoven traits and characteristics that make up that autistic person. So whereas in the past we might have, or whereas things have gotten a little bit confused, and we might think of on the spectrum as being that linear thing, so low functioning and high functioning, now we think of it more as in on the spectrum, and there could be more like a colour spectrum down here, and there could be any number of different traits and any number of traits that might be more difficult for that person or have more of an impact on their ability to access the things that they want to access or not. So not so simple as high and low functioning or a linear spectrum. And then we have this terminology, person with autism. And when you listen to autistic voices, when the surveys have gone around, the majority of autistic voices have said that they wanted to come away from this language, that this kind of language doesn't really gel with them, that their autism isn't something that they can pick up and put down like a suitcase. It's something of who they are in themselves. It is their identity. It's not something that they can put away. Saying that, there are some autistic people who do still prefer person with autism. So with any of this that we're talking about today, it's the most important thing is to talk to that person themselves, to talk to that individual to see what it is that feels right for them. But as I said, when the studies have shown that the majority of autistic people have voiced that they would prefer what's called identity first language. So this is who I am autistic, and it is part of my whole being. It's not just something that I can put down and pick up. It is who I am, and that's an empowering thing for them. And I've just got a little bit here about ADHD strengths, and we hear a lot about ADHD. Of course, it's in the title that it's a deficit, but actually what we're finding now is there's lots more coming out about the strengths of ADHD, and we can think about it as being as those things. So things like impulsivity can actually lead to creativity, and can lead to really throwing yourself into something, for example. So that impulsivity isn't necessarily in itself an issue. It can be seen as a strength in some ways, and maybe in other ways not so helpful, depending on what the activity is that that person wants to do. Okay, so I do want to give a brief caveat here about neurodiversity affirming practices, and about maybe what's called the neurodiversity movement. Is that with all best intention, with the best will in the world, we want to come forward and talk about neurodiversity as this wonderful, amazing thing, and it is. And we want to come away from talking about it as implicitly a deficit and implicitly an issue. However, for some neurodivergent people, so people who have a profile where there are certain traits and characteristics within that profile that are actually very difficult for them, and they find it very difficult to access the things they want to access, or for caregivers of young people who have the same, who have difficulties accessing their social world, for example, have difficulties developing their language skills and connecting with others and doing the things that they want to do. Actually, it can feel quite diminishing of their experience if we're talking too far around it not being a problem, not being an issue. It can feel that, well, actually for these people it can be an issue. sometimes people have gotten into talking about neurodiversity, neurodivergent profiles as being a superpower. And there might be some things within people's profiles that are really great about them and enable them to do great things, and we really want to empower that. But in and of itself, I think it's important to think about these different profiles and thinking as just that. These are different profiles, different ways of accessing the world and receiving the world, and really what we don't want to do is diminish other people's experience in that. So I just wanted to give a brief caveat there. So then moving on, let's have a brief chat about the double empathy problem. So the double empathy problem was coined by a man called Dr. Damien Milton. And what he did was he had a think about all the sociological bits and pieces that went on before. And oh, I'm so sorry, I'm having trouble with my presentation. 1 second. There we go. So he had to think about the sociological and psychological studies that have gone on before about autism, and about thinking about autism as being sort of a social communication deficit, amongst other things. And he took that information and he married that with his own lived experience as an autistic person, and also listened to the voices of other autistic people, and looked and observed the different communications that happen between autistic people and non-autistic individuals. And what he found was that yes, there are many misunderstandings that occur between an autistic individual and a non-autistic individual, but the same amount of misunderstandings simply don't occur between an autistic person and an autistic person when they're communicating, in the same way that the same amount of misunderstandings don't occur between non-autistic individuals. So then it really shapes the way we're thinking about communication and autistic communication. And it shows that, well, if things are happening well on this side of the coin, and things are happening well on this side of the coin, but there's a problem happening here, why then are we singling out just one person in that communication? Why then are we putting the onus on that person to change, or to make themselves understand the other person more? Surely it takes two to tango, it takes two to communicate. Surely this should be a mutual understanding. There should be this is a mutual problem for us to fix together, to come together to fix together. And there is ongoing research about this. Dr. Damien Milton, he brought out a paper, I think in around 2022. It was 10 years after he brought out the first one, and there's more to be learned about this. It's an exciting thing. It's an emerging thing, and it's shaping a lot of the things we do. It's shaping a lot of the way that we might think about autism. But I think I'm also wondering now how it's applying to any number of neurodivergent profiles, if we think about it in this way. So let's come back then to how this might shape the way we think about speech, language and communication, and the way that we all navigate in our social world. So we started off thinking about the building blocks, the things that we put together and we use to present ourselves in our social world, and then to gather things, gather our learning, which then inputs back into these tools and these things that we're using, and helps to develop those things, and it shapes those things. So if we have an autistic person who takes their speech and their language and their social experience, for example. They take that, they have an idea, they have an expectation of what they want, how they want this communication to go, how they want to be received, and how they want to receive other people, how they want to communicate with them. And they bring it into their social world. And actually what they find is that they're being told, well, that's not quite right, what you're doing there. And I know that this is what you expected, but it's not what we're expecting. So that needs to change. We have to think now about then, what are they bringing back? What's feeding then back into their speech, language and social experience development? Is it a positive thing that they're gaining? Are they then have they had a positive experience in their social world, which will then enable them and empower them to come back into it? Or are we actually giving them the communication within our social world that what they're doing isn't quite right, and they might not feel quite so welcome? So would they then want to come back in? So there's a very interesting relationship here between what autistic people, what neurodivergent people are getting out of their social world, and actually then what we're then seeing. So if there's a reluctance, for example, to make friends, if there's a reluctance to engage in a community, why might that be? Is it because of an experience that they've had in their social world and the way that they've been received? So what can we do about it? Well, we can. Oh, hello.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're still on the current.
Well,
okay.
if you can take everything I said about the double empathy problem and pretend that this was the visual you were looking at, it might have made a little bit more sense. We do have this person down here at the bottom, so we've got somebody presenting the way that they're presenting, talking and using their speech, language and their social experience to talk to someone, and that person isn't necessarily understanding. And this is a two-way thing. So we were talking about how speech, language and social experience, when I was talking about how these things we take into our social world, and then we're thinking about how our social world impacts then, how we're received, impacts on those things, and the way that we might then learn and develop those from those experiences, learn and develop from that communication and interaction in our social world, and how that might colour in and develop in with these skills. So I'm thinking about, so we're coming on to creating an inclusive environment. So we will have, actually, I tell you what, let me just come back onto here for a brief moment. So just to drive home this point, I'll give you an example. So you have someone, for example, we know that in early years, a child goes into their social world, and this is how they're really learning. Typically, we would learn language this way. We'd hear the language going on around us from our parents. We're storing that in there. We're bringing it back into ourselves, and we're developing that. We're developing our understanding through that. I think we probably all had it when a young one has gone into nursery and maybe learned a few words we didn't know, and that they even knew and picked up from us, because they've picked that up from their social world. Or even if it's an explicit thing, they've gone into their social world, they've sat down with a speech and language therapist or with their teacher, and they've been taught that language. Again, it's the same thing. There's been a communication and there's been an interaction, and they've brought it back. So if we think about that, instead of thinking about that in terms of language only, if we're thinking about that in terms of that social experience, our expectations, our ideas of what a successful communication is, we might want to think about now about creating an inclusive environment with what we know about neurodiversity, that neurodiversity is a thing, that there are different ways of thinking, different ways of brain development and different ways of being, and that there isn't necessarily a right way of being and a wrong way of being. And if we know from the double empathy problem that actually empathy works both ways, that it is everybody's responsibility in that social space to make that an inclusive, empowering, safe environment for everyone, what does that mean for us then? So what are we bringing into the social space for our young people? What are we bringing into that social world to support their understanding about themselves and the expectations they have going back into their social world? How are we developing that? And really, another take-home, a real take-home message I would like to send through the airways today is that what's most important is that the knowledge is key, the understanding of that thing, the understanding of neurodiversity and the sort of challenging of some of the things we might have heard before about it and what we might have been, with all the best intentions, bringing into the social world of our neurodivergent young people. So we might be asking the question, is my input neurodiverse affirming? And I can imagine, I know this from a practitioner standpoint, when I first sort of opened my ears and opened my eyes to this this way of thinking, it was really anxiety provoking. I was worrying, you know, is this thing that I'm doing, is that neurodiverse affirming? Can I do this anymore? Is that the right thing to do? You know, how do I know what I'm doing is right? You know, particularly with tried and tested methods, we might be thinking, gosh, are these neurodiverse affirming interventions, for example? And I thought a lot about this through the years, and one of the things that I keep coming back to that's really helped me feel better about it and feel stronger in my convictions that what I'm doing is the right thing for the young people I'm working with, is instead of asking sort of, is my input neurodiverse affirming, and trying to maybe list the things that are and the things that aren't in my head, a better question to ask might be, what underpins the support I'm giving? So thinking about the intention before the intervention. What is my understanding here? What am I trying to do with this intervention? I feel that's more important. What am I trying to achieve? What underpins it? Is it that neurotypical is the norm? What am I teaching this young person in this interaction with them, with this intervention that I'm giving? Am I telling them that neurotypical is the norm and that's the way that they need to be, and that this is a set of rules that you need to follow? Or am I bringing to the table that actually neurodiversity is the norm, that we all think differently and that's perfectly okay, and we're all finding a way in this life, and we are all welcome in the social space? Is what I'm doing blaming or shaming? Am I saying to these young people what they're doing is wrong and calling them out for it in front of lots of people? You know, something as innocuous as a reward chart, if we're mapping that onto actually something that's very much their identity, very much something about themselves, well, are we blaming and shaming them for something that's actually just down to them being different and not necessarily them being wrong? You know, we really always want to come away from blaming and shaming in our interventions, in the support that we give our young people. So am I blaming and shaming, or am I promoting this positive self-view? Am I saying to them, am I being strength-based in what I'm doing? Am I making sure to say that with the way you're thinking is okay, but maybe let's think about how that's impacting the social world for everyone. Let's all sit down and think about that together. Am I encouraging masking? I won't get into the ins and outs of masking, but essentially, am I promoting a lifestyle for this young person where they feel that they need to change who they are as a person before they walk out into the world, that they need to be uncomfortable in order to make other people uncomfortable, and they need to wear a mask that's okay? Or am I empowering them to be themselves in their social world, and to maybe just be aware of other people in that, but be proud of themselves in that you can be yourself and you're welcome in the social world? Am I asking them to adjust for other people, or am I promoting advocacy for themselves, for them to say, actually, I'm autistic, or I'm an ADHD, or I have ADHD, and these are the things that I need from you? Or am I constantly asking them to think, what does the world need from me? These are just some things that go through my mind. So we can do this in the words that we use. And the words that we use, we can use these words in more professional points of view, in meetings, EHCP meetings, you know, our team around the child meetings, whatever it might be, we can be using these words, or we can be using them out and about when we're just talking about neurodiversity, when we're talking about our young people or to our young people. And what we can see here is that you know, one of them is a very medical model, medical base, where we're actually asking, we're thinking about it in a way that there's a neurotypical way of being, and that's the right way. You know, we're thinking about deficits and impairments, and we're thinking about it as being challenging behavior, and actually we can flip that and we can think about it as differences instead. We can talk about it as traits and characteristics instead. We can think about how actually this part of somebody's profile, a spectrum maybe of their profile, is actually empowering for them in some ways, but might make things more difficult for them in other ways. So if somebody thrives on routine and familiarity, that's a lovely strengths way, it's a positive way of talking about it. And then we might say, so, you know, when those things are threatened, when something isn't quite going right in that routine for them, if there's a change in that routine, well, because they really thrive on that routine, that's where things might get tricky for them. Instead of saying that they are being inflexible and they are being rigid. You see, it's just a sort of different way of thinking about it. I could probably give an entire lecture on eye contact, but essentially we know that a lot of autistic people, I think neurodivergent people on the whole, might find eye contact to be a very difficult thing, and actually feel so uncomfortable to them. And yet it's been the goal of so many things, so many social skills groups, so much social communication intervention in the past has really focused on this eye contact. And actually, if we think about that, then again, what we're doing when we're saying this, we're saying that person needs to feel uncomfortable, and they're doing something wrong, they're avoiding it, almost like it's a choice. So maybe we can talk about it a bit differently. We can think about it as a preference for indirect gaze instead, for example, and that's their preference, and they might need to advocate for themselves in the future and say, I'm sorry, I have a preference for an, well, they probably won't say that, but they might say, you know, I might not be looking at you. I actually find that really hard to do. I find it really uncomfortable to do, but I am listening. I am listening to you. They might want to say that instead of having to make themselves feel uncomfortable. So it's just, you know, the language that we're using, we're bringing into that social space, and it's helping to shape their understanding and shape those skills that they then bring back into the social space, remember. We can also think about the things we write. So it might be, you might be a practitioner yourself listening to this, or you might be a parent or a caregiver, and we're thinking about all the different paperwork and reports and everything else that might go into getting the right support for our young people. right? And whenever I write a report, I always have in the back of my mind this young person in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time might somehow have access to this report, or might feel like they want to glance over it one day. And what are my words saying to that young person about the way they were received as a child? And I'd really like for them to know that they were seen and understood and accepted. So instead of this really deficit-based language when we're talking about difficulties and how they are misinterpreting things and how they might be unaware of nonverbal social cues, and these are all things that they need to change, actually we can flip that and we can think about them, well, actually, yes, autistic individuals are more likely to be exposed to misunderstandings between themselves and others, because there are lots of different neurodiversities out there, and we know from the double empathy problem that that can be where misunderstandings occur on both sides. So just being a little bit more descriptive with what we're saying and keeping that person in mind, keeping the adult that will be in mind, or even some of our young people do read their own reports as they get a little bit older as well. And we can also think about the things we say to our young people. Again, what are we bringing to that communication and interaction with them in that social space? What's my intent behind what I'm saying? We might say, well, it's rude to interrupt and you're making other people feel really uncomfortable here. And I'm feeling like, okay, that feels like blaming and shaming. That feels like I'm encouraging them to hold back. So I wonder if we can think about this a bit differently. Maybe we can validate that their need to say something. You really needed to tell me that quickly, and actually let's sit down and explore that together. What was it that brought that on, and how is that impacting on everybody's social space? And you're feeling like you really want to talk, and other people also do. We're just exploring it all together. This is a big one for me. Can you just remember next time? I'm very fortunate that people are very patient with me, because I do forget a lot of things a lot of the time. And I think that can be so frustrating to hear. Can't you just remember next time? Well, I tried to remember this time and that didn't work. What's more helpful maybe is if we come to them and we say, well, what can we do next time? What could help you remember next time? And I think another really key thing here is not necessarily feeling like you know the answers either. Like, well, why don't you get a diary? Maybe that will work. Why don't we do this? Actually bringing it to them and supporting our young people to identify what works for them, because as we know, there are so many different things that play into remembering something, and it can be really frustrating, somebody coming in and bringing those things to you when actually you don't know yourself what will help. What could help is somebody coming to you with that. So I've got one more. Oh, and the things we do as well. So coming back to when we were talking about our interventions themselves, kind of implicitly non-neurodiverse affirming. So are they, so when I say neurodiverse affirming, I mean, are they something that's going to empower and create this inclusive environment, or not? And actually, if you think about these things, I spoke about maybe let's not list things and say which are good things to do now and which are not very good things to do now. Actually, what we can do is really just think a little bit more on the intention behind what we're doing and how we are putting these supports in place. If we're talking about making and maintaining friendships, well, when we've met in the middle in our social world with our young people, are we making sure that we've got their views on that? Do they want to make friends? Do they feel that actually they are making friends? And is that is that okay for them, that it might not look like what we think a friendship looks like, but maybe exploring with them what friendships mean to them, instead of necessarily imposing on them what we think a friendship needs to look like. For example, in our behavior goals, are we thinking about this individual as maybe just having a more stronger reaction to things that we wouldn't necessarily expect them to, because we're bringing our social experience and what we know into the social world. You know, it can be the most frustrating thing when you've had a reaction to something and somebody tells you, well, it's not that big a deal. Why are you reacting this way? Actually, what can feel better and more empowering and create this inclusive environment for everyone, is that we're not necessarily worrying about the size of the reaction, but that the reaction happened, and exploring that a bit more. We're validating the feeling and exploring it a bit more. And we're just hopeful then that whatever anybody's bringing into the social space, we are communicating safety, we're communicating inclusion, we're communicating advocacy and empowerment. And really that needs to underpin everything that we do to make this a space we can all thrive in. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. I believe we have some questions.
Yeah, Carrie, thank you so much. That was brilliant. Yeah, we'll get on to the Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes, so we'll get through a couple of the questions if we can. So first one, my grandson is constantly being given detentions for making noises and talking in class by one particular teacher. He's autistic, has ADHD and echolalia. He's really suffering. What can we do to change this? The teacher is not listening or responding to our concerns.
Okay, so so I wonder if maybe having a conversation around neurodiversity and around some of the things that we've spoken about today, and maybe coming to the teacher with that. I think if I had a teacher I wanted to sit down and maybe have this conversation with, that's where I would start. I might start saying, well, why don't we restart? Why don't we reframe what we know about autism, what we know about these things. I'd really like to talk about this young person in that way, and how we can make the environment work for them, because what their behavior is telling me is that they're communicating that they don't feel safe in this space, and they're communicating to me that there's something that they're not quite gelling with in the social space, in their social world. So I wonder what we can do as adults to lessen that for him, to create a safe environment for him. And I couldn't give you any I couldn't give you any specific things right now, because I don't know your child, and I don't know the specifics for that child, and I wouldn't want to assume that I did. I wonder if this is something that you can explore with your child as well, if that's possible. And I don't have time to go into it, but there is so much on echolalia. There's so much exciting stuff around that, so I would really encourage you to have a look at that, and have a look particularly at something called Gestalt language processing. I can't go into it now, but yeah, please do, and I'm happy to write that down for you and send that to you if you'd like.
Brilliant, thank you, Carrie. Next question. So how would you say the child and the parent should tell people who do not know them to explain what they have and what they need?
So I think using this identity first language is actually very empowering, not only to the autistic young person or to neurodivergent people, but to the caregivers as well. I feel that there's sort of in through the years, because of maybe the way that we've thought about these things in the past, because of the medical model that we have, there is a sort of stigma still kind of lingering attached. We're getting away from it, which is great, but it's still kind of there. And I think maybe because we're British as well, we don't, say things, out and proud all that often, especially when it comes to our health and our being, and our mental health as well. We might lessen, we might feel like it's a bit of a taboo subject. So I would say, be proud and open, and be mindful what you're bringing to that interaction with that person. And I would say let's open it up as a conversation. Let's open this up as something that we can all come together on. I feel advocating for our children, for our young people, is so important. I think that's what you've identified here. And then how do I do that? I think if there's one small, so that's kind of like a big overview of what we can do, but maybe if there's one small little bit of advice there, it might be to so we're being out and proud with it, we're being everything else, we're advocating for our child. I think knowing when to advocate and knowing the right things to say in front of your child is really important, to show, okay, I'm going to co-advocate with you, for example, I'm going to do this alongside you. And knowing when actually it's about having a bit of discretion as well, to allow that young person to just feel like, this is their social space as much as anyone. And this is an ordinary thing. So before a party, for example, maybe just having a word with the parent of whatever, and saying what might be going on for your child and what works for them, and then working with that young person as they get older to then advocate for themselves.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question. So, is there a difficulty in underrepresenting an issue by framing it in completely positive terms? There's a space between thriving and struggling, and some people might assume that one step down from that thriving is not struggling but managing.
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, that's why I put that caveat in there. It's about meeting people where they're at and listening to the voices of people who have different profiles and different ways of thinking. I think that, as I said on the caveat page, definitely we have to be careful that we've been sort of talking for autistic people and telling them how they should be, and talking for all different manners of people with neurodivergent profiles, and sort of saying this is the way that it should be. So we're really trying to come away from that, but in that we might accidentally kind of go back around again and start talking for people again, and sort of saying, well, no, it's not a difficulty that you have. It's not this that you have actually. It's a superpower. Oh, it's you shouldn't. So I think that it's just so important that we're not talking for people, that we're allowing people to talk their truths, to have their voice, to be successful in that social space in the way that they present themselves, and to listen to people's lived experience. And for some people, actually, there are aspects of their neurodivergence, there are aspects of their thinking, of their sensory profiles, of their language profiles, of their ability to connect with other people that are so difficult for them, even if it seems on the outside that it's not, or it shouldn't be. We all interact with our world differently, and we should validate everybody's experience.
Thank you, Carrie. Just a couple more questions. So, can you give any strategies for helping to prepare a child who thrives on routine for changes to that routine? Simple changes such as parents having time out or also preparing for transitions to high school. At the moment, I'm trying to give as much notice as possible, talking it through and giving details, but not sure this is the best technique. Sorry, I'm a parent who is only just starting on the neurodivergent understanding.
Yeah, I think so. If we come back to this idea of sort of intention and intervention, so clearly here we're intending to give them as much notice. We're intending to lessen that anxiety, aren't we? And I think that's a really good place to start. I wonder if again, I don't know your child, so I couldn't say exactly what strategies might be best for them. But if there is a space for you to sit down with your child and ask them what might help them, I think you'd be surprised that even very young children might be able to say something, at least choose something, have a choice in that. You know, the keeping it visual. I know I would say this as a speech and language therapist, keeping things visual really helps. We do it all the time as adults. I couldn't live without my diary and my timetable, and actually I can't understate enough the importance of those visuals. When we say something, it just gets lost to the ether. But having it visual and in a way that that young person can understand and relate to, it just means that it's up there, they can see it. We're reminding them that this thing is happening. And then also another thing that's really important, there's the giving of the information, and then it's the, well, what happens when that young person is feeling distressed about this? How are we responding to that young person in that moment? Are there things we can be doing to support them to what's called co-regulate? Are we helping their nervous systems to relax? So in that moment, what we're doing is we're trying to give them as much notice as possible, but you know, it might not ever feel good, ever, a change in routine. And that's just their way of thinking, that's the way they are. But what we can support that young person to do is to know what to do when those feelings come. So finding things that work for them. Do we need do we need a cuddle? Do we need something to eat? Do we need to go and listen to a bit of music or something to bring your nervous system down, to help you to feel better about the situation? I hope that helps.
Thank you. Final question, because I know we're running out of time. So my son, who is 8 and autistic, is often hitting his sister, age 5, and not very kind to her. It usually comes from nowhere, hard to spot the trigger, sometimes due to attention being placed on her or jealousy. He doesn't listen or respond when I ask him to stop doing it. Any advice on how to help with sibling rivalry? He also has ADHD, but undiagnosed.
And that is tricky. It's a very tricky one. I think definitely coming at it from, you know, when we were talking about sort of those behavior goals, we're sort of reframing this behavior as a communication. So what is going on there? I mean, we might have an idea that there is a kind of, there's this sibling rivalry. I don't know how old your children are, but I can imagine, you know, the sibling rivalry happens anyway. And when you have things like ADHD and autism and autistic experience in the mix of that, it can feel a lot more pronounced. So you know, I hear you, I see you, is basically what I'm saying there. A bit like what we were saying before from the last question, I would really encourage you to think about ways of helping to lessen the feelings of it, to, well, not lessen, but to help him feel safe in that moment before we then talk about actually the ins and outs and that, before we talk about what we can do next time. In the moment, I know you want it to sort of stop, but I would say, respond to the communication, respond to the anxiety, respond to his need for feeling for safety, and then respond to the things that maybe we will need to change next time. Hopefully something like that might help.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you so much for that presentation. It was so good.